Good afternoon. I'm really, really pleased to welcome you all here to hear Danah Boyd. Danah is, first and foremost, an alum of the I School. But more importantly, she is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. She's also a research assistant professor at NYU and a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. She is currently on leave from Microsoft running a think and do tank called Data and Society Research Institute, something to follow. She's just launching this and it's going to be very cool. You probably already know, since you're here, that Danah is the reigning expert on how young people use the internet, according to Fortune magazine, which named her as the smartest academic in tech. I love it. The Washington Post also dubbed her the high priestess of social networking. As you know, her research focuses on how youth integrate technology into their everyday practices and other interactions between technology and society. And she's here to talk about her new book. It's complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens. After the lecture, she will also be available to sign copies of her book for you, so stick around and get a signed copy. Over to you, Danah.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It is an absolute delight to be back here on campus, especially because so much of this book comes from time that I spent here. And so, you know, I was walking up the hill this morning and just sort of thinking about all of the different crazy conversations that I've had in different parts here. So my goal for today's talk is to sort of give you an understanding of what I was trying to achieve with the book, and to give you a taste by looking at one of the different topics, but then really to drive it into an opportunity for question and answer, because really that's when things get fun, and that way you can sort of help me figure out what's interesting to you. So let me sort of back up and give you some context of how this book came into being. So I started, I grew up as a teenager on the internet. I was part of the first generation of young people who had access to the internet, in part because my brother was a geek, and he did this terrible thing that teenage boys should never do to their siblings, which is that he used up the phone line, which was just not fair in any way. And so I was really frustrated by the constant sounds that were being made out of the phone line, which I didn't understand. And I marched into his room and I was like, what is this? And sure enough, he shows me that the internet is made of people. And all of a sudden, things became much more interesting. So I spent my teen years really talking to strangers, and it was a really amazing moment in time because it was a period in which nobody was afraid of talking to strangers. In fact, if you were using technology in any way, you had to be doing something educational, because why else would you be using a computer? So we could get away with murder, and boy, we didn't get away with murder, but we got pretty close in the kinds of trouble we managed to cause. And I remember my first $700 phone bill from various BBSs, which meant that my brother and I needed to find a way to get internet access where we didn't pay for it. This resulted in some less than legal activities. So I went to college. I decided to study computer science. I decided to build the systems that I was so madly in love with. And when I went to build them, I realized I was so much more interested in how people were using them, what they were doing with them, how you could make sense of it. And indeed, I ended up deciding I really wanted to retrain and rethink from an anthropological point of view. I had the great honor of working with Genevieve Bell at Intel while I was working on my master's, and she exposed me to a whole different approach. And that's actually how I ended up here at Berkeley. It was an amazing opportunity to think about these issues from different perspectives. And the I School was just this, you know, a hotbed of awesome where I could come at these problems from so many different disciplinary angles. So I came here really with the idea of trying to understand and study different kinds of social technologies. Now, mind you, let's put this into a time frame, which is that it was December of 2002 when I applied to Berkeley. And it was at that same time that I got a phone call about a new online site that was emerging that was called Friendster. And some people thought I might find it really interesting. So I started actually building a slew of different visualizations, trying to make sense of it. Some of you were in that original data set, particularly the folks in that corner. What we did was we visualized all of the relationships and the network graphs that were going on there, and we decided that we would show this at a rave because this was what was happening in San Francisco at the time, was that was what was social media, social network sites were connected with early adopters who were primarily self-defined geeks, freaks, and queers. And that meant the burner communities, that meant gay men in San Francisco, and that meant all sorts of bloggers. And so that was sort of an interesting moment to try to make sense of this stuff. Then while I was here, my beloved advisor, who unfortunately passed away, who this book is dedicated to, Peter Lyman, he came to me and said, I've got this money to look at young people. Can we look at young people together? And I was like, sure, I'd love to know what had changed. And at the time, there was no understanding that young people were leading the charge on social technologies. In fact, they weren't seen that way at all. They were seen sort of as just sort of separate to the conversation. Their technology use was sort of different. And in fact, I went into this project thinking that I would take a break from my study of social network sites, take a break from my study of social media, so that I could look at what young people were doing with technology. Sure enough, that's not how things would pan out. By the time we got through the process, I ended up jumping in to look at how young people were using technology for it to really be all about MySpace. And so what ended up happening is that my research ended up watching the rise and fall of MySpace and the rise and fall of Facebook, and we can argue and discuss that one. But sort of it was this amazing moment of really getting to see cycles, and if you have any anthropological training, you realize the sort of beauty of being able to actually see a full season, or full cyclical process and see all the seasons flow. And indeed, that's what I got to see with technology. So I ended up having this moment of watching all of this play out, which was great, and I was trying to understand identity production, I was trying to understand peer sociality, very scholarly context, very scholarly notions. And then the moral panic started kicking in. And it was about 2004 when I started dealing with the first one, really into 2005, when we saw the concern about MySpace and the question of sexual predation. And I was really frustrated by it because I saw this huge disconnect between what I saw in the data and what I saw in terms of the media rhetoric. And I was trying to resolve that. I was trying to find a way to narrate through this. So I ended up getting involved in a lot of policy-making decisions at the time, which is not always the best idea when you're a naive and hopeful academic, is to sort of show up and be like, you guys don't get it. And they're like, no, you don't get it. And so we had a sort of fascinating moment where I realized the challenges and the disconnects between scholarship and the public conversations. So what ended up happening is I kept hearing more and more anxieties, more and more fears, more and more concerns from parents, from educators, from journalists. And I kept being like, is that really what's going on? And so as I was finishing my dissertation, I kept taking notes of these different concerns. And so rather than actually just republishing out my dissertation, I decided to go back to the drawing table and try to write a book that would have a more public-facing audience and to address it through the various concerns that I kept hearing. And indeed, this book is organized around some of those issues. And those issues include things like, is bullying so much worse online? Do kids care about privacy? Why do kids spend so much time using technology? What is it about the sexuality and dynamics there? Is the internet a great equalizer and the sort of positive notion? Are kids digital natives? These are all the kinds of frames and tropes that I spend some time here in this. And this book is very much meant as an intervention. It's meant to sort of say, let's actually step back and appreciate young people from their point of view, from their perspective, and see what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve. And in this process of rethinking my dissertation, of rewriting all this material that I'd collected over so many years, I started to realize something really important, which is that social media wasn't this attractor, it wasn't this thing that people were turning to, it was in fact a relief valve. And it's that aspect of things where it became a relief valve that I really wanted to unpack and try to understand why. And I think it's really important to realize that there's been some significant transformations in the last 30 years in American society that we often don't understand or take into consideration. So I'm going to start by sort of unpacking those so that you can sort of see it and understand that perspective, and then we'll go into one of the topics in particular. If you were growing up in the United States from the period after the war, after World War II, through the end of the 70s, and especially in middle upper class American society, you probably had a level of freedom that was pretty unprecedented. You could get on your bike, you could roam, you were home by dark, right? And if your parents were trying to find you, they had to sort of walk around the neighborhood to figure out where you were, they had to call up neighbors. This was pretty common in middle and upper class American society. A lot of this changed in the 1980s, and there are a couple of through lines as to reasons why. First, there was the rise of 24/7 news. And what 24/7 news did was that it convinced you that there were dangers everywhere, and they were in your backyard, right? People were being abducted, people were being raped, kids were being harmed, and it was everywhere, right? And it didn't matter that the statistics showed that it really wasn't everywhere because you were convinced it was going to happen to your child. At the same time, we started seeing political mobilization around things that had become pretty common, most notably latchkey kids. So I was one of those kids, which basically the notion of a latchkey kid was that you got on the school bus at the end of school. In theory, you went to your own home, or at least you got there fast enough for the phone call from your mother from work, right? And you went home where, in theory, you had a healthy snack, Lucky Charms. You did your homework, watched TV, right? And you did this whole ritual, and then you were like, oh, Mom, it was great, everything was fine, right? Well, this anxiety emerged in the 80s that this was going to damage a whole slew of young people. And so we started implementing all of these after-school programs, these institutionalized structures, so that today's middle upper class youth go from morning to night in all sorts of structured activities. And if you don't, you are a bad parent, right? And that has become this dynamic where young people have very little freedom and flexibility. So then let's look at some of the other places where they'd have freedom and flexibility, right? First was the idea of the school bus. The school bus was actually really, really important for American youth because you showed up at the stop, and you were there with enough time to sort of, hang out for a little bit with your neighbors. You got on the bus, you were on the bus for some period of time where you were hanging out and joking around with your friends. You got to school long enough that you could hang out at the lockers, and then you repeat on the way back, right? That was a lot of unstructured time where you were messing around. We have really eliminated that. In most places inside this country, instead of seeing 80+% of young people going on a school bus, we will often see less than 20% of young people on a school bus. I think the national average is somewhere around 30, but it's really significant in critical ways. So that whole point of hanging out has really been eliminated. The ability to just sort of roam and be out in public. We've actually created loitering laws, curfew laws, trespassing laws. That has made those spaces very, very difficult. The freedom of getting a car when by the time you were 16, which was this amazing moment where you could really change things. Yeah, you can still get a car, but in most states in this country, you can no longer drive another teenager, which means that your ability to get a car so you could pick up your friends and hang out has been obliterated. So you end up seeing young people who don't even bother getting licenses because it's no fun. There's no desire to this. It's just all work and no play. And then on top of that, you have this question of where can they go? So you see all these public places kicking people out because of those sort of trespassing issues or the loitering issues. And then you see the private commercial spaces not wanting young people there because they don't spend money. Part of it is transformations in how people had access to money. So, if you go back 30 years, you had newspaper routes. Well, we know what happened to those. You had the idea that a 12-year-old was babysitting, which we can't imagine in most middle upper class parts of American society. By the time you were in high school, you probably worked in fast food or some other kind of job like that. Guess what? These jobs, especially in an economic decline post-2008, are almost exclusively for 50-plus crowds at this point. So your access to your own capital has also significantly declined. Right? All of these factors play into it. And then you add one more critical turn to this, which is that it becomes a collective action issue. You may have the freedom to get out. You may not have to deal with structures as a kid, but that doesn't mean your friends can't. And when you start to see this collective action issue, you run into a really significant issue, which is like, why sneak out? Why go through the possibility of getting yourself into trouble when none of your friends can? And so this is where we see the internet come along the way. All of a sudden, we have this technology that means you don't have to leave the home, that you don't have to find synchronous time, that you can just get together with your friends whenever, however, and that makes it extraordinarily desirable. And this was what was really interesting about the early days of social media, because it was a place of your own. It was a place for young people. It was a place for teenagers. Adults weren't present. And that was really the first wave of my work. The first wave of my work was really about like, freedom, this is great, I love it. And then all of a sudden, parents started coming along, right? And that's when things got dicey, right? Because all of a sudden, all of the kinds of things that were about structuring and restricting and limiting young people in public came into the same things that happened online. And it got layered even more because of the fact that these spaces were engaging large swaths of American youth, which meant that we had a lot of racist rhetoric of like, I don't want my child to be exposed to people like that, right? And like that had every different angle that you could possibly imagine. But it became part of the conversation with regard to social media. So the narrative became about trying to make it private, right? Find the private space. And indeed, this is where Facebook got really interesting. Now, part of it is, I go through in this book, and I'm happy to do it in Q&A, is the 2006 to 2007 school year was a really significant one because it was the split between Facebook and MySpace. And that split got narrated entirely in terms of race and class terms. It got narrated by young people. It got magnified by journalists in very significant ways. And so you have these sort of interesting moments because Facebook came along as the safe, quiet, clean alternative, a very privileged and very white notion in this country. But it also was one of those places where parents started really spending a lot of time in. And as many of the researchers, in the school can tell you, Facebook went from being a very private place where you could sort of be just amongst your friends to the things that slipped more and more, both because of the privacy settings and because of the culture. But it wasn't just that. It was the fact that your parents demanded that they have access to your account that really changed a lot of this. So now I'm going to go through one of the topics here. I'm going to go through the topic of privacy so I can give us some topic to sort of play with. And the topic of privacy is interesting to me because it's the only thing that I would say significantly changed over the decade in which I was studying this. When I was starting this out in 2003, 2004, looking at a lot of this online material, I could mostly read what I saw online. I could make sense of it. Because the thing about it is young people were writing for everybody except their parents, right? Which means that they didn't mind adults looking as long as you weren't their parents, as long as you weren't their teacher, as long as you weren't going to get them in trouble, as long as you weren't a college admissions officer. As long as you were just like a cool adult, no problem. That changed, right? And that changed because adults that were really held immediate power over them started to be online. And so we started to see young people become much more attentive to how they tried to think about privacy. This is when I started to realize that privacy isn't simply about this question of control of information, which is a very technical notion, right? Technologists often think that if we just control the flow of information, we can achieve privacy. That's actually not how people experience privacy. It's one of the reasons why we see this huge disconnect between the rhetoric that people use and the experiences and the language and the technology. It just turns into a mess. So what I started to realize is that for young people, privacy was the control of a social situation, which meant that it wasn't just about whether the information was made accessible, but who got to interpret it, who succeeded in interpreting it, and how that sense-making went about. Now, in order to really deal with that, what you have to think about is how do you have agency or power over a social situation? That's really critical in order to manage privacy in a meaningful sense. Second thing is, how do you understand the context? This is not just a digital thing, right? Think back to your own teen years, right? You knew that one guy in school where if you told him something and you told him not to tell anybody, he would inevitably tell everybody, right? That was a really important character because you knew you messed up the first time, which is how something got spread that you didn't want spread. But then in the future, you went up to him and he was like, hey, don't tell anybody this, and then you would watch as it flowed, right? And that's part of understanding a context and being able to navigate a context, to understand who you can trust, who will flow information in which ways. And of course, the third is to actually have the skills to do that, which is a development process, right? Figuring out how to do this. So that's sort of one key thing, is that when you start to see privacy as this attempt to control a social situation, you start to see one way in which young people go about it. The other critical sort of pillar for thinking about this is that young people are looking to be in public, but that doesn't mean that they want to be public, which is to say that they want to be a part of the public world, they want to understand their place in it, they want to connect with people, they're really excited about that, but that doesn't mean they want everything to go down on their permanent record, right? And they're trying to figure out how to make sense of that. And that's when I started to realize that young people were developing a whole slew of sophisticated tactics in order to achieve privacy in ways that made sense, given the situation that they were operating inside. So I'm going to give you two really interesting technical versions of it, and then sort of one which is a more social. And the reason why the two technical ones are interesting is not because they are common, but because they showcase things at the extreme. So the first I'll tell you is about a young woman that I met, who she had this problem because everybody would drudge things up from the past to cause drama. And by the past, by the way, she meant about the last month, right? So that was like, that's the time frame we're working in. So she was trying to find a way to make the past not come into the present. And she decided that what she would do is that every day she would log into Facebook. It was at the time where Facebook was really popular. Every time she would log into Facebook, she would go and she would read the comments that were left, the things that people had left on her page, and then she would delete them. She would log in, she would write statuses, she would post pictures, and the next day she would log in and she would delete them. She would go and people would leave things for her, and the next day she would log in and delete them. And she constantly cleansed things, right? And she tried to turn Facebook, which was all about persistent data, into a real-time activity. Now, why is this really interesting? Let's start with Snapchat. Right? What Snapchat has basically done is not about like, let's just share the sexy pictures. By the way, the sexy pictures, by and large, are shared with 20-somethings. They're not shared with teenagers. But it's more instead about how do you actually create a situation where you can turn this into something that's like just about now, that's not about bringing up the past, that's not about trying to remember why you took that photo that you can't even remember what it's about, and really trying to make it into a thing in the present. Right? That becomes really interesting. It also becomes interesting in terms of Snapchat to think of it in terms of how you think of attention. So normally when we think about things involving attention, you're dealing with streams of content, which is part of how you lose track of things, right? You log into Instagram and you're like whoosh, 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 and that's overwhelming. Snapchat changes the rules. It says you have 7 seconds or whatever to look at this image, and then it goes away. And so what it says is like, I'm going to give you 7 seconds. Are you going to pay attention to me for 7 seconds? Right? And that's a very interesting shift in the dynamics of all of it. And we start to see it in the kinds of experimentation that young people are doing in terms of attempts to achieve privacy in Facebook lead the way where things like Snapchat make total sense. Okay, so then we have her best friend who's running into a totally different problem. So one of the things, if you are under state care in any particular way, think foster care, that means the state is your guardian. When the state is your guardian, they have the right to look at a whole slew of material that we don't normally think about when we're talking about parenting and guardianship. Right? And indeed, one of the things I run into whenever I talk to young people who are engaging in foster is the expectation from social services to look at everything that they ever put up. So this young woman, she's frustrated. She's sick and tired of having to explain herself to her caseworker. She's really annoyed. And so she decides she's going to delete Facebook. Now, if you've ever tried to delete Facebook, you know how this goes, right? Look at all these people that will miss you. They'll be so sad. You can't possibly do this. You will be so upset. And then they, of course, give you an out. They say you don't have to delete your account. You can just deactivate it, right? And if you deactivate it, you can come in the next day and you can come back to it. So she got an idea. She deactivated her account. The next day she logged in, she reactivated her account. The next day, and then she immediately deactivated it at the end of the night. She logged in the next day, reactivated, deactivated, reactivated, deactivated every day. She called it the Super Logout, right? It was a phenomenal way of making certain that she was properly logged out. And she made it so that only people could send her messages, comment, engage when she was logged in simultaneously. Right? It's pretty interesting to think about how that works. Now, why is that intriguing? Because the thing is she's really trying to control the situation. She's trying to make certain that nothing can spin out of her control. Nobody can post things that will get her into trouble. And I said to her, well, what happens if a caseworker is, online at the same time you are, right? What happens when they see it then? She's just like, that's why I never log in, before 7 p.m. In her head, basically the caseworkers she could rely on were working government jobs, were there during the day. Regardless of how accurate that was, she made this a context that she could control, right? And that becomes really important to her. Now, these are two technical means where you start to see these things fuzz. But that's actually not the most common practice of achieving privacy. The most common way in which young people started to achieve privacy or started to try to make sense of it was about something that I think of as social steganography. Steganography is an old crypto term. It means hiding in plain sight. And young people would find all sorts of ways of trying to put their content up there where nobody could actually make sense of it. So I'll tell you this through my favorite geeky example from the book, which is a young woman named Carmen, who's of Argentinian descent, which is really important to the story, in that her mother has no understanding of anything of British cultural references, right? So Carmen is sort of wanting to communicate with her friends, but not always wanting her family to get in the way. She loved that her family was all on Facebook. It was great. She loved it when it was about anything family-oriented, but not when it was about sort of stuff within her school situation. So she and her boyfriend had broken up, and she really wanted a way to communicate that she was having a lousy day. And she wanted love, she wanted attention, she wanted support, and she was trying to figure out how she should express herself to get that. Now, if you're a teenager, the first thing you think of is what is the perfect song lyric to express any emotion out there, right? So she's trying to find the perfect song lyric. She knows if she puts something up sappy, that her mother will think she's suicidal. It had happened before. So she's trying to figure out what she can post that will convey this issue to her friends but not trigger her mother. And indeed, she decides to put up song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who do not know the Monty Python reference, this is a song sung when the key character is being crucified in the life of Brian. There is nothing happy about this scene, but the song lyrics look so wonderful. And indeed, her mother immediately comments, "It looks like you're having a great day." And her friends immediately text her, right? This is a really powerful way of negotiating things. Now, this is, of course, a lightweight, fun way of doing this. We see it all over the place. On Twitter, it's referred to as subtweeting. We hear it even referred to as subtweeting on Instagram, which is fascinating to me. And it's basically all of the ways where you can start talking by making certain that only people in the know can understand things, right? So you can think about it in terms of using pronouns. Oh my gosh, can you believe what she said? I know, like Friday night, like, oh my gosh. Right? And you're like, whoa, there's a conversation and a series of references that I am not following. And that, of course, is the point, right? And what I started to realize was that as young people had gotten more engaged with these different tools, and they had to negotiate their families in particular ways, they got more and more sophisticated for trying to encode content. Now, some of this, of course, blurs with humor, and that's part of where I have a delightful, fun time with this. So, teenagers are aware of advertising. They don't feel as though they have a choice as to whether or not they deal with advertising, because the thing about it is this is their only place where they can hang out, so they'll just deal with it. But the thing is that they are aware of it and they love to play with it. So Gmail is one of the few things that is actually not blocked in most schools, because schools don't block Google, but they block a lot of the other social media sites. So teenagers will often during the day use Gmail to go back and forth. And there is nothing funnier if you're a 15-year-old boy than getting your friends to get diapers ads, right? Like, that's just great. So you write these like ridiculous messages and then you put them in white text so you can send things to your friends so they get really funny ads, right? And you can see teenage boy logic in this, but you can also see this moment of awareness of how they're trying to move across the system. Now that, of course, gets played in other ways. So teenagers figured out at some point that if they reference brand names in their Facebook posts, that they were more likely to appear on people's wall or sort of people's newsfeed and stream. So you'll see these posts that are like, hey, you want to hang out, Nike? What? And part of it is that they realize that they can use these brands in order to make things more visible. Now, of course, sometimes that goes terribly awry, and there's nothing more entertaining to me than watching people, especially market and analysts, think they understand what's going on when they don't. And so, I was on a panel with a bunch of brand representatives in a marketing forum, which is always an entertaining experience in and of itself. And one of the representatives was from Coca-Cola, who was proudly talking about how popular they were on all social media, and they were the coolest. Everybody was friending them, and of course I burst out laughing, and that's also not a good way to make friends. And the moderator was like, why are you laughing? And I said, I've noticed how popular Coca-Cola was, so I looked into it. That's not the Coke people are referring to. Not a good way to make friends with brands. So the thing is that in light of this very commercialized culture, it's these little moments of resistance, these little moments of challenging things, these little moments of playing with it, because of the fact that they have so little control otherwise. Now, when you think about this in terms of what's going on in terms of privacy, part of it is you realize that what young people are just trying to do is that they're trying to get access to some form of public life. They have none of the kinds of access that we normally take for granted. They live in a very commercially saturated situation. They have limited opportunities to go and just hang out with their friends simply. And so they find places in the interstices. They find spaces where they make it their own. If you've ever run a blog for a long time, you'll have experienced this, which is that all of a sudden, on one day, you'll have a whole group of teenagers who've suddenly invaded your comments to talk about something that has nothing to do with your comments. Or nothing to do with your post. And why? Because it's one of the things that doesn't get blocked. And of course, then the schools come around and block it, and it becomes this, unbelievable game. Because you see young people looking for a place where they can just hang out. And they're hanging out in a very commercialized world because it's the one place that they have access to. But in spite of this, they're finding their ways to sort of make things work. And this sort of goes back to sort of then the plea of this book. I think that we've done a disservice to young people because we have spent so much time worrying and fearing about everything that might go wrong that we end up locking them out of opportunities to be a part of public life. Public life is not just sort of like an accident, you should just get a part of it, it'd be fun. It's actually a really critical learning process. Because we have this weird dynamic in the US where it's like if we just lock everybody down until they're 18, when they're 18 they're going to be magically capable of functioning. And that's actually not really viable. So of course, you know, as anybody who's spent time on this campus or any other campus knows, they show up as freshmen in college not always aware of how to negotiate a whole slew of different dynamics. And so part of me is, you know, on one hand, very excited by the fact that they use technology to make it work for them, you know, in spite of whatever else is going on. But the other part of me is like, let's give them some credit. Let's actually open up some space for them. And let's allow teenagers to be a part of the public life, to engage with the kind of freedom that we value in this country. And with that, thank you. So this is the fun part for me, which is that I get to basically run around and talk about Q&A and go in any direction you want to go in. So where do you want to go?
I was telling my friends yesterday at Easter Brunch that I was coming here, and
oh, is it not turned on yet?
doesn't turn.
Let's see if that actually works. Success?
Oh,
Go for it.
Okay. These are friends of who have young children, and I was wondering, is there a part of your book which I can point to that is essentially like too long, didn't read, but here's advice to help parents not fear for their kids?
I mean, on one hand, I hope that that's what the book does in general, right? Now that said, you know, it's a challenge because it requires making a cognitive leap about the decisions you make when your children are tiny versus the decisions you make when they're teenagers, right? And that's a process. And I think that that's often misunderstood as like, we have to go from that point of children being dependent on us in all sorts of very critical ways to being independent adults. We all went through this transition. It is bumpy, it is imperfect, it is a whole set of processes. And this is, you know, with technology, it becomes a really critical dynamic of how you negotiate it. Because on one hand, you want to support young people to have a certain amount of freedom, and you hope that they, you know, bumps and bruises but not broken bones. And you have to figure out when to pull back at other points. But you have to appreciate that technology is in many ways just like every other aspect of these environments that people engage with really publicly. Which is to say that young people will make, you know, idiots of themselves. I can guarantee it, right? Like that's part of this process. The question is, how do you actually engage this in a productive way for learning? How do you support them through that online or off? How do you give them the skills to negotiate these things, to limit the kinds of mistakes that they will make or to learn from the ones that they do? Right? And that's where it's really tricky because technology is often positioned as somehow super different, but actually that's not what I end up seeing all the time. And that's what the book really does nail home, is that so much of what we see is the good, bad, and ugly of teenagehood, right? And so this is really tricky because I think that our contemporary parenting structure is about like protect young people from everything rather than empowering them and giving them the skills to navigate the mistakes that they make. And I think the thing about technology, which is a little bit different than other things, is it makes visible to us the things that we didn't previously see. Which is that when your child was, you know, causing trouble, you know, out by the creek with you know, her friends, like you didn't necessarily see all of what went on. But when you have these traces left on social media, you see them and you blame the technology rather than thinking through how to navigate it. And it's really hard. And I'll be blunt, one of the big things that I struggle with in this material is that the young people who are already privileged and already doing okay, they're fine. They're gonna make mistakes, they're gonna live them down. I'm not really worried about them. What scares me the most are the least privileged populations who, one, are showing how much they're struggling online and we're not paying attention to them, and two, are the populations who don't get to live down their mistakes. And that double-edged sword is where I really struggle, you know. And this is what I'll say, you know, doing these book tours makes it really difficult because obviously the people who show up here are caring and concerned and really engaged, which is awesome. But the thing is that for those of you who are parents, you know, two pieces of advice. First off, you know, don't focus on being everybody to your child. Build an entire network of other adults that are in your children's life. Aunts, uncles, cousins, school friends, coaches, all these other people. Because then when they kick you out of whatever the latest social media is, that's fine, because those other adults are going to look out for them and make sure they're okay. And they're not going to rat them out when they're swearing, but they're going to rat them out when things are serious, right? The second thing is look out for your kids' friends. Because not all of them have the supportive households that we rely on. And this means that when your son's best friend's parents are going through a divorce, be there. Don't necessarily ask him about a divorce, that's not fun. But just make certain that you're listening and you're engaged, because when he's lashing out, that's when you're going to start to see issues. And these are collective action issues. So there's the things that you can negotiate through your child, but it's also about your child's community. And that's where it's these are in many ways not about technology, but they're about seeing technology as part of the whole picture. And that's where your relationship with those other kids through technology can get you there. Cool. Other questions?
I'm interested to see if in any of your work that any evidence of stress from curation of online activity emerges in teenagers, because I feel or it seems to me that there are lots of avatars that we have online in many different situations, and who you are in game is different than who you are maybe on Facebook, and you might have a different Twitter handle. I mean, there are all of these pieces, and some of them do leave traces. And as a teenager, I was threatened with the permanent record, but the permanent record was something that was being gathered very specifically at school. It wasn't that I was contributing accidentally, other material.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering if any of it is resulting in verbalized or observable stress from having to curate all of these activities.
So I'm not going to be able to answer your question exactly, in part, well, one, because I haven't measured it, but two, because stress is so much higher for this cohort than other cohorts, but I'm not convinced that it has to do with technology. I think it has to do with the very real economic crisis that everyone's feeling in different ways. Whether we're talking about debt, whether we're talking about opportunities, whether we're talking about stressed out parents. And stress amongst parents right now is at a pretty all-time high. And unfortunately, that bleeds into what goes on with young people. Now, in terms of the curation and the different identities and these aspects of things, part of it is that teenagers have long tried out ways of how they would be perceived by different groups. This was often done in physical fashions, which is that you try to be seen as cool differently amongst your church friends versus your summer camp friends versus your school friends. And you try to negotiate this because you were trying to see which one clicked. Right, and that back to school year had a routine to it, which is this year I'm going to be cool by whatever definition of cool mattered to you in that moment. And you go through these moments of watching young people try to do this. You watch the back from the holidays, basically Christmas in this country, play out that rule as well. So this is where it's really tricky, because they've done these navigations, it's just that they were so locked in to particular spaces. What's been fascinating to me online is how in the early days of the internet, the ones I grew up in, that kind of experimentation happened all the time in a ton of different places. But for most young people today, that is not what's going on, because everybody they encounter online is connected to their school, church, summer camp already. And so what they end up dealing with is a different problem, which is the problem of context collapse, which is that if you ended up having this different world within your church friends than you did within your school friends, you could navigate them separately because, Sunday was separate from the rest, Monday through Friday. But online, you have to be friends with all of them on the same site. And all of a sudden, you have to figure out how to navigate the world simultaneously. And these collapsed contexts are one of the most significant challenges for everybody participating on these sites. This is adults as well, right? Now, the thing about adult society and how we deal with collapsed contexts is we write scripts, we formalize situations so that this is how we're to interact in a situation, or we ply everybody with alcohol, right? These are really key parts of this process, right? Think about the wedding. It's the best example of both of these, right? Sit everybody in really clear ways so that hopefully no drama will occur, and ply everybody with alcohol, right? And this is how we survive with a massive context collapse. Online, we deal with this over and over again, and we don't let kids drink, right? So the thing is they're trying to navigate these different worlds. They're trying to live down past identities. They're trying to figure out how do they see themselves, and it becomes a different challenge of navigating it. I don't see them as inherently stressed. I see them as trying to learn the rules, trying to make sense of it, right? Trying to figure out how they can work through it and live down things. Are there particular teenagers who run into massive troubles with this? Oh yeah, absolutely, right? And I think that it's really important to identify why certain groups of young people run into particular issues here. Some of them are very specific classes of youth. LGBT youth, and the ways in which they navigate this gets much more dicey and much more confused because they're trying to figure out an identity that they haven't yet worked through, but they don't want it colliding back into their school identities in different ways until they've worked it out. Young people who are struggling with different aspects of mental health issues. And it's not just because they're making that visible, but because one of the things about young people who are struggling with mental health is that they often have unhealthy or problematic relationships that they can't live down very easily in a persistent environment, of which the internet is one of them. And this, by the way, is where we get to some issues on bullying, which I'm happy to dive in deep if you would like. But the issue with bullying is that many of the young people who are both bullies, perpetrators, and victims are struggling with mental health issues in ways where that gets completely mixed up in all of these identity issues. So I see all of it playing out, but the thing is that it's wrapped up so much with all of the other interpersonal dynamics that it's hard to tease things out entirely. I'm to take this. By the way, this is not for the room, this is for the remote camera.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have you ever replicated your study in a different context than the US? And if not, where would you like to establish a comparison and why?
Right. So I have not done it elsewhere in the US for this kind of research. Well, first off, it took 10 years. And I know this country. But I spent a lot of time working with scholars and colleagues around the world. And it was interesting to see where we saw commonalities and where we saw differences. The UK, the US, and Australia compete for who could be most fear-mongering. It's an amazing combination. We see it in policy, we see it in parenting, and we see it in tabloids. And I think that the UK usually wins in tabloids. But that fear-mongering means that we see a lot of similar dynamics. When we get to societies where young people have a lot more freedom to roam, we actually see the use of technology be very, very different. So I'll use Italy as an example, since I have some scholars and colleagues that have done a lot of work in Italy, where young people getting together with their friends in the town square is no big deal. Like, it's just not an issue. You can totally do this from really early years. As a result, what ended up happening with social media is that Facebook wasn't that interesting at all until it became a place for uploading the funny things that you were doing in person, till the phone became a coordination device. All of these things that we normally associate with adults in America, but not necessarily teenagers, but teenagers and adults look very similar there because their social access is very similar. And then, of course, when you switch into other contexts where the cultural frames around aspects, for example, of identity are different, you see things that fit into that frame. So, for example, in Japan, you see a very different idea of what it means to use your name and the kind of arrogance that is assumed when everything is real names oriented. And that, of course, plays out in terms of how people use it. So each of these technologies, even as the same technology spreads, ends up fitting within the cultural frame. But it's like most of my work, even though I started with the social media, I started realizing how much of it was trying to unpack what was about American youth. And I actually think it's a really good thing that everywhere else in the world isn't as crazy as we are. That said, there are some things that are really unique to the US that I think that we don't necessarily appreciate the value of. And so, especially since we're on a college campus, I'll explain one of them, which is that elite college education is not actually really about the classes. I mean, all of you who teach are really good at your teaching jobs. But the thing about going to an elite college is that it's a social engineering experience, right? It's about really mixing and matching different people so that you build out these networks that are extraordinarily powerful. So what happens is that young people, especially from less privileged populations in this country, would show up on college campuses all of a sudden get exposed to totally different networks, those networks play a significant role in the future. This is really, really important at both how we sustain elite structures in the US, but also in terms of how we transform a lot of different societies. A lot of what we think about as Silicon Valley comes back to certain kinds of networks that happen that are really transformative. Well, the difficulty with social media in light of this is that what we start to see, especially in a culture of fearing of others, is that American youth are being trained that the moment they find out what college they're going to go to, they log into whatever the service of the day is, MySpace, Facebook, we move on. They figure out who their roommate is, they decide their roommate isn't like them, and they want a different roommate assignment. They build the networks of people that are like them before they show up on campus, and the social engineering experiment is actually getting undermined. And so these weird aspects of where American society differs versus the globe, whereas most other places in the world, you go to university in your hometown, you live at home, you're building these same connections, you don't have these transformations. And I think that's really critical when we think about the long-term issues of what makes the US unique and different, because I think a lot of it is about that transition, how we see teenagers transitioning into college, military, et cetera. And by the way, I mentioned the college version. Military is actually much worse. Military was a guaranteed path to middle class for most working class youth in this country. It no longer is. And that actually is much more devastating in the kinds of stuff that I see than college. College still has a lot of that. Military is a much different story. Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't thank you for your presentation before. Thank you.
Thank you.
I understand that most of your work is about social media, but I wonder if you have any observations about how immersion in technology in general is co-constructing children's cognition differently in positive ways or ways that we should be concerned about.
Right. So first I'll say, I love Steven Pinker's really snarky comments on this, where he basically reminds people that any stimuli that you are exposed to changes your cognition. Get over it, that's the point of learning. Which I just sort of love, because we have a sort of obsession that there is bad stimuli, and we get so obsessed with these bad exposures because it's different. There is no doubt to me that young people's experiences, exposures to these technologies are shaping how they deal with things. And some of it means that they're learning to optimize within systems. Which means that, I think about this boy that I met who was we were sitting down and he was working on flirting with a girl. And so, of course, he spent 45 minutes crafting the perfect 160-character text message, right, to look like it was casually written, right? And it's just this amazing moment of watching the process of flirtation, be able to step back and do it at a distance to look like it's casual and try to figure out what that looks like. Is that different than flirting? Oh, heck yeah. But at the same time, it's not, because his nervousness, his discomfort, his how do I practice, how do I say the right thing in front of her, it plays out in a different way, but it's still the same, right? And I thought that was really, really phenomenal to see this, because it requires a different kind of negotiation. And indeed, we see that in some of the other things I see. For example, I'm on the board of an organization called Crisis Text Line, which connects young people who are in crisis to counselors who can support them. And it's, think of a hotline except for text messaging. And it's really important to switch to text messaging for hotlines because it allows you to have privacy. And often what kids are calling about, they don't want their parents to overhear. And that's actually part of the problem. But what's been really interesting that we've seen as we've started to do the data analysis on it is that because young people expect this counselor to be there and that they understand this is a trained counselor, they lead with the situation rather than going through social rituals of hello, how are you, can I get help kind of thing. They will literally write to us and be like, my father raped me last night, what do I do? And you're like, oh, right? So that's a sort of weird thing where we're seeing the changes of the past. Now, so how does this play out in terms of sort of more everyday dynamics? What it means is that young people have learned how to optimize for text, for visual information, try to figure out how to navigate this. Now, of course, some of this is going to be to their advantage, right? Many of the jobs in which we work in right now, you have to learn how to manage your boss in email, not necessarily through formalized meetings. But that also means that they're not as practiced and experienced negotiating the kinds of interpersonal conflict in a face-to-face environment. Now, that's not because of the technology in this case. Actually, that's entirely because we've limited their opportunities to interact informally, and that actually requires a lot of that. But I really see it. I really see that they are not as experienced in negotiating those dynamics, and that their only experience in negotiating negotiating conflict is done in very formalized settings. So, for example, schools have all these groups that group projects, but it very much structures when you can meet and how you interact. And of course, this changes how we negotiate these things out. So there's a lot of cognitive changes, but I'm not convinced that they're bad. I'm convinced that they're different. I'm convinced that they're playing out. I'm convinced we're going to be able to see different aspects of it. But we're also seeing young people try to optimize and develop skills for the situations that they have in front of them. And if we don't like which skills they're optimizing for, which situations they're optimizing for, let's change their opportunities. One more question? Wait, I'm going to do two. I'm going to do Deirdre and then Eric. Cheating.
So here's my question. I haven't read the whole book yet, so forgive me to the extent that it's naive. But watching my daughter and her friends use Instagram and watching them be like crestfallen when they see somebody else is having fun and they're not, I had this interesting conversation with my daughter. I was like, when you get together with your friends, and this is playing off they're hanging out, what do? And she's like, we bitch, right? We moan, we complain. And I said, yeah. So when your friends get together on Instagram, what do? We share all our sunny moments. And I was like, so do you understand that? And so it seems to me that the kids actually are making each other feel bad, not necessarily intentionally, or there's some of that too, but it's different. It's this, I use Facebook more, I feel sadder, right, kind of thing. And I'm wondering how that relates to this sense of it's just about hanging out, because it seems like it's also about something else.
So this is the part where we start to actually see celebrity culture in full force. This was the dynamic that we saw in terms of how people's experiences and lives got narrated by media for a long time. Whereas you imagine that this was sort of this wonderful, like the teenagers who, I love the writings on celebrity in general, that if you are just famous, everything will be awesome, you'll have infinite freedom. Now, if you've ever interacted with people who have navigated celebrity, that's not how celebrity operates, right? But part of it is, of course, what you see when you negotiate celebrity is that dynamic. Of course, we got to see this get restructured in everyday environment through like reality TV. Because apparently reality TV is like reality, right? Like obviously that's what our lives should look like if we were all having more fun. So we saw these same dynamics. What's really fascinating to me is that we're seeing the same cultural logic of celebrity now play out across everybody. Now, some of the best work on this is Terry Sempt, wrote original stuff on micro-celebrity. Was followed up by Alice Marwick, who wrote a lot more in her latest book, Status Update, about this. But this is a practice and a logic that I see teenagers having to negotiate. Now, the funny thing about it is that they do go through these cycles. If they succeed, they learn and they realize that this is all performative. And that's not a bad lesson to be learned during that period. But the thing is it requires learning. It is not something that is done automatically. It's something that I actually think is a really important critical literacy. It's a critical literacy for any kind of media narrative of what people's lives are like, because if it's done right, it basically engenders a critical form of empathy. An appreciation of like why other people, what they're putting out there may not be their full story, and then how to approach them when things go wrong. But it requires exactly the kinds of interventions you're doing, and that sadly most parents aren't, right? And so it ends up being this, if we just block the technology, I won't see other people having fun, and I won't have to negotiate this. But that doesn't end, and I hate to say it, but fear of missing out narratives don't end at 18 either, right? Like, there might be people in this room that, so this is where it becomes a really tricky thing. So this is, yes, you are right to point something that's very key, and the question then is how do you help people negotiate through that? All right, Eric, and then I have to actually quit, and then I will actually answer questions afterwards, where I will also sign. Yes, which is good.
Okay, first, thank you for putting together this piece of work, because it's really, it's so deep, and I know it's just a huge part of your career, and it's really insightful, and it's going to be really useful to people across a lot of, not just parents, but researchers and everyday people. So thank you for the time and effort to go to that length to put something together. Rebellion. I want to hit on this for a minute, because I don't know, I'm curious what your thoughts are, but I want to resurface this thread that seems to be in a lot of this, where everything from the fact that you probably involved with phone phreaking to get online to rebel against the technology. You mentioned this sort of steganography as a kind of technique to misuse the kind of appropriately sanctioned usage of the technology. Even things, I'm thinking of like skateboard culture is all about kind of like a rebellion against things. And you talked about these laws and how they're kind of putting new constraints. and I don't know if it's appropriate, but when I think about it, maybe this is me trying to be optimistic about things, of course, but that this thing, which we'll just call technology or social media, that it's just another thing that the youth is engaging with in quite likely appropriate ways of rebelling against it, using it as a material to kind of misuse. And I think in some sense, I think, well, if there's too many constraints and there's too many rules, they're going to move on to something else to rebel against, or they're going to reform. I feel like that's such an important part of, again, playing with identity, but also just this. You have to rebel. I mean, it could be small rebellions, it could be larger rebellions, but it's part of playing with identity. And I feel like that could be, I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of that important part of just life.
So there's resistance and there's rebellion, and it really depends on how you're responding into different actors of power, right? The little acts of resistance happen all over the place, right? These are these moments of like, yeah, Mom, I'll give you my password, but you're not going to understand anything I say, right? These moments of sort of challenging that in a light way. Rebellion is sort of a more interesting dynamic because it's really taking wholesale and challenging the structures as they operate holistically. What's funny, of course, is that actually most young people don't rebel full force. They'll engage in large acts of resistance as they do this boundary work. I mean, this is classic lying, right? You lie in order to understand these dynamics. That is actually a really critical learning process. But these moments of more holistic sort of rebellion end up happening, in different environments and different forms. What's really fascinating to me is where you see technology being enabling full force rebellion. And I'll go there because I can't resist going to the 4chan space because it'll be too much fun. So part of it is, as I sort of alluded to, I was, and as Eric did a good job of making very clear, I was a part of a hacker community when I was growing up, and my cohort was really interested in hacking the security economy. Mostly just to prove that we could, right? There was nothing funnier than, of course, breaking into the Navy system, proving that they were vulnerable, just to leave some dumb message because you could, right? It really wasn't about trying to launch missiles or whatever. What was fascinating to me is that when I saw teenagers start to use social media, I expected to see a lot more of that kind of hacker mindset, and we didn't see it. But we ended up seeing is that about the same percentage of kids that were part of the hacker community when I was growing up, which was equivalent to the online group, ended up also still being a part of the hacker community. Except that as things changed, what they were resisting, what they were rebelling against, wasn't necessarily the security economy at the time, but it was in many ways the attention economy, right? And it was a way of understanding the market forces that were around you, and 4chan was phenomenal for this. If you don't know what 4chan is, do not look it up. Just read the Wikipedia entry and we'll sort of leave it at that. But the thing about 4chan is it's the underbelly of the internet where we see all sorts of interesting dynamics as they play out. And one of the things that this cohort in the earliest days of 4chan is that they got very annoyed with the moral panics, with the questions of online sexual predation. They didn't feel like it was being fairly narrated. And they particularly targeted Oprah Winfrey because they were really frustrated that she was propagating this over and over again. So they engaged in a form of teenage rebellion, and they decided that what they were going to do is that they were going to get Oprah Winfrey to talk about the next great threat to children as the form of a sexual predator who's coming in the form of a teddy bear, otherwise known as pedo bear. And pedo bear was a phallic imagery, also don't look it up, that they spent a lot of time architecting this conversation on all of her different forums that meant that they got her to put an entire episode together about how the next great threat to children was a teddy bear, right? It was pretty entertaining. They thought they were having fun. This was great. Of course, they take it to a next level, and we start to see some interesting developments here. The next sort of thing that they start to challenge was these top 100 lists. In a world of listicles, everybody should be challenging the top 100 lists. But what they targeted was Time Magazine's 100 most influential people list, where, of course, it was a popularity contest as to who would be most popular. So, of course, the first thing they do is put up Moot, who is the nickname for the person who founded 4chan. And of course, Time came back and be like, we are smarter than all of you. We know that you're gaming this. None of your things will count. We're not counting Moot, da 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 da. And of course, when they published the list of the top 100 most influential people, the message, if you read the first letter of every name as it was printed down the order that they knew would be printed, said marble cake, also the game. A total in-joke, again, don't look it up, total in-joke within 4chan. Why was this interesting? They basically challenged and said, no, we're even smarter than you are. We are able to play with you. Now, this cohort of people who are sort of messing with things, engaging these forms of teenage rebellion, challenging these major, information media landscapes at a really significant level, right? A significant form of rebellion. Along comes a set of political issues that they find much more of their taste. And we see WikiLeaks emerge. And we see the rise of capital A Anonymous. We see the rise of Snowden. We see a whole set of these kinds of political mobilizations. That is a form of rebellion that is the kind of rebellion that we often fetishize because it engages in forms of long-term resistance at a cultural level. That is still alive and well. It is alive and well all over the internet, but it is always sort of in the interstitials. It's not the dominant practice. The majority of resistance, the majority of rebellion is a much more lightweight, constantly negotiated, really still about having status within your peer group kinds of dynamic. And I would say that that part of things hasn't changed that much and isn't more technical than anything else. But the really significant development of political activism, that's going to be super technical. And on that note, I'm going to end, and I'm going to stick around. I'm going to sign books. There are books for sale. Of course, I'd love it if you bought a book. But thank you all for today. I really appreciate it.